Good afternoon, everyone. Perhaps it is morning or evening where you are. Thank you so much for attending this webinar, Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology with me. My name is Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting company. So we are here to provide assistance to doctoral students at any stage of the dissertation process. So from topic development all the way through to the final dissertation defense, we have an awesome team of research mentors, including qualitative and quantitative mentors to help out with wherever you are in the process. So if you would like more information, you can find that in this slide. You'll see it pop up as well, contact information throughout the webinar today. And again at the end. And then I'm also joined by Brittany, who's kind of running things behind the scenes, just in case of any technical issues, but she has also provided some links in the chat box. Our website, you can get to our website using those links. We've got some amazing free resources available, kind of no matter what questions you have, you can probably find answers on our website, including our blog. You'll also see links to archived webinars as well as our upcoming webinar schedule. So the same place where you found this webinar, you can get signed up for upcoming webinars. You will also receive within the next 24 to 48 hours a copy of the recording for today. So if you're coming in a little bit late, that will be available to you, as well as the slide deck from today. So again, I'm Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. This is the Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology webinar. If you do have questions, go ahead and pop those into the question and answer box during the webinar. Brittany will be fielding any questions about sort of what we do at Statistics Solutions, the services that we provide, and then if there are qual methods specific, so webinar specific questions that you have, I will make sure that we have time at the end of the webinar today to answer those. So this slide presents both an overview of those main sections that should be included in your methodology chapter, but it also provides the overview of today's webinar. So we'll touch on each of these sections so we can talk a little bit more about what should be included in each section. So if you're struggling with what to, include in your qual methods chapter, this is the webinar for you. So it'll begin with the introduction. It'll include the research design, the role of the researcher, the methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and summary. So that's our outline for today as well. One little caveat before we begin, though, is always if your school has provided a different template or checklist, something that looks different in any way from this, go with what your school tells you to do. Okay, there are enough hurdles to jump through as a doctoral student and as a doctoral candidate. You don't want to make more for yourself. So ultimately, you want to follow the guidelines from your school. So in your introduction section to your methodology chapter, I always think about this as leaning back and looking forward. So in the introduction, this needs to be a quick little summary of your first and second chapters, right? Your intro chapter and your lit review chapter. So you need to get quickly into what the purpose of the study is. So you're reminding the reader of the purpose of the study. And this needs to be word for word, exactly the same as everywhere else it is presented in your dissertation. This is not the time to get creative and change things, no matter how redundant it seems. You're stating it exactly the same. I realize that gets a little bit boring, but it has to be exactly the same. Words have meaning, and changing one word can have profound implications for where your study's going. Okay, so word for word, purpose of the study. Then you want to provide a preview of the major sections. So sort of what we saw in that previous slide and what we're going to talk about today in the webinar. Any any of those main sections, sort of the here's what's coming up, right? So you lean back and you look forward in this introduction. So you're establishing this roadmap for your reader and the context of the chapter. Your research design section is going to be a lot of your methods chapter. Okay, so here what you want to do is restate the research question or questions, depending on how many you have. And again, this is something that you want to do word for word, right? So not the time to get creative with wording. Your research questions have to appear exactly the same here as they do everywhere else. You're also going to want to identify and define or describe whatever it is that you are studying. Okay, whatever that concept is, or if it's a phenomenological study, the phenomenon. If it's a case study, that case. Whatever it is that you're studying, this is where you describe what that is. Okay, then what you want to do is to identify the, we might call it tradition or approach. Is it qualitative or quantitative? And the design. So this is the bulk of this section. I am assuming that you're here because you want to know about qualitative studies. And I apologize in advance if you've come in with questions about quantitative. I'm not the person to ask about that, but we have amazing statisticians on staff and they have great webinars. So those would be more appropriate. We're going to assume this is qualitative today. So you are going to talk about a qualitative approach or qualitative tradition and why and when qualitative studies are the most appropriate. Okay. To do this, though, you also need to have a pretty good handle on what a quantitative study looks like and when you might conduct a quantitative study. So the idea here is that you are demonstrating to your reader, your committee, and your chair that you're familiar with both qualitative and quantitative studies, that you're familiar enough with both that you can say for sure that a qualitative study is best suited based on your research problem, purpose, and research questions. Okay, so everything has to align, and the problem, purpose, and research questions are what ultimately drives the design. So you'll identify that tradition. Is it qualitative? Is it quantitative? Okay, talk a little bit about both, what they're good for, and then make the case that qualitative is the most appropriate. For your research design, then, so the qualitative design within that, if it's a case study, if it's a, ethnography, you want to do the same thing. So you'll sketch out why a couple of different qualitative designs might be helpful to address your research questions, why they might be appropriate. But this is where you want to make the case that, for example, a phenomenological study is the most appropriate design to address your research questions. Okay, so first you have to demonstrate that you're familiar with these, because that's how you ultimately, make the decision that one approach is better or more appropriate than the others. And then you want to really make the case or drive that home. Okay, so both for, is it qualitative or quantitative, and then the design within that. When you are looking to understand sort of the how and the why behind something, people's perspectives, their experiences, this is when qualitative designs are the most helpful. So they're good for textual data. If you're conducting interviews or focus groups, if you are working with words in documents and conducting a document analysis, or even something visual like observations, and you maybe have notes or you have even drawings or photographs, you can use the qualitative design. The goal here is not necessarily to generalize findings. Okay, so in quantitative research, that's we think about that a little bit more, but in qualitative designs, that's not necessarily what we're looking to do. We don't test hypotheses in qualitative research either. So you won't be generating a null or alternate hypothesis based on research questions. We're not quantifying our results here. Okay, so really, I like to think about this in terms of, do we need to collect people's perspectives on something? And if so, then it is probably a good indication that a qualitative study is most appropriate. I'm going to give a very high-level overview of a few possible qualitative designs. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. There just isn't time, but this is just to get you thinking about the different possibilities within qualitative research, remembering, of course, that there are certainly other possibilities. So case studies, phenomenological research, generic or general qualitative designs, grounded theory, and ethnography. So case studies are really helpful when we're looking at some case, some example over time and in a really in-depth way. This is like deep, deep down the rabbit hole, right? So, you're looking, I think of this as a really sort of 360 deep dive into whatever it is that you're studying, okay? So it could be a multiple case study. It doesn't necessarily have to be a single case. If it's a multiple case study, it's going to be bound by some kind of uniting factor. So let's say you are interested in the implementation of a new 9th grade math curriculum, okay? It's been implemented in a big school district, and there are 8 different high schools in the district. I don't even know if that's realistic, but we're just going to pretend. So 8 different high schools in the district, and let's say 6 of the high schools have seen, measurable improvements in student outcomes as a result of this new curriculum, and 2 have not. Okay, so we might ask what's going on in those 2 school districts. So that might be a good case study, right? To understand, 6 have been successful, but 2 haven't. What's happening here that's making it so that these 2 are not as successful? Okay, so in case studies, then you collect data using multiple data collection methods. This is really kind of the hallmark of case studies, because again, you've got this 360 lens on whatever this problem is, okay? So you might conduct interviews, and in our example, you might conduct interviews with teachers, with administrators, with instructional coaches. Perhaps you conduct some document analysis on the new curriculum, different activities, assignments, things like that, okay? And the idea is to really generate this description of the case, what's happening, right? So any themes that emerge from exploring that case. So what patterns are you finding after analyzing the data? Phenomenological studies are quite different in that they're really rooted in first philosophy and psychology. So when we're looking to understand how people make meaning of an experience, how they assign meaning to that experience, we call that the lived experience. These are good phenomenological studies. And so unlike case studies where you use a variety of different kinds of data collection techniques, phenomenological studies really make use of in-depth interviews. And when I say in-depth, I mean, I'm talking about like hours, okay, of just talking with people, collecting their stories. And so the idea is that, and again, this goes back to sort of the philosophical underpinnings of phenomenological studies, and there are variations of this that I am not going to get into here, but the idea that there are some shared structure of an experience. And so in phenomenological studies, you're sort of looking at what that structure is, what the essence is. So there's assumed to be a commonality of experience between people who have been through it and the way that they assign meaning to it. Generic qualitative designs are really helpful for studies that don't fit like specifically into a case study or don't fit specifically into phenomenology or grounded theory, where you may need to be selective in the elements of the design that you pick. And so you hear the term generic qualitative design, and there's quite a bit written about this. It is a legitimate design. So if you are arguing with your committee or your chair about whether or not this is good enough, it absolutely is. But the term generic automatically shuts some people down. You might also say a general qualitative design. You might also call it a qualitative descriptive design. So the idea is that there is flexibility here. Okay, and so maybe the focus of your study is less about how people are making this deep psychological meaning out of something that they've been through, and you just are focused on the outward experience. Maybe it's a mixed method study. So you're borrowing some quantitative elements as well. So in generic qualitative designs, or this more sort of generalized qualitative approach, you might use interviews, you might use questionnaires, you might use surveys, you might also use, document analysis or observations. And so it sounds like you have a whole, buffet of choices, right? And you do, but everything has to make sense in the context of your study. So you have to be able to justify your decisions here. So while you get to choose, it has to be appropriate based on, again, problem, purpose, research questions. So the idea is that it generates this understanding of the outward experience, okay, of the participants. And so I throw this reference in here specifically for people who are maybe looking at an approach that is a little bit more flexible and how to justify that, how to defend that decision in the methods chapter. Definitely check out Percy and colleagues. I realize it's a bit of a dated reference, but I think it's very, very helpful. Less commonly, I work with students who are conducting grounded theory or ethnographic studies. So grounded theory is really helpful when we may not know a whole lot about a topic. It's very good to generate theory from participants' experiences. So you approach grounded theory very differently than you approach other qualitative methods. You're not starting with a theoretical framework, you're ending with a theoretical framework. And so I generally do not recommend this for novice researchers because it's extremely time intensive, but it works differently than sort of what we think of as the traditional, research cycle. So you would start off by talking with people, interviewing them, conducting some field work, maybe interviews, analyzing those data, figuring out what patterns are coming up, generating more questions based on what you found, and then going out and sampling more people, interviewing more people, conducting more field work. And so it's this back and forth process of data collection and data analysis until you reach this point of theoretical saturation where you basically kind of know everything there is to know about whatever it is that you are trying to understand, this piece of the topic, and produce some explanatory framework or theory that's grounded in the data. Okay, so the theory comes from the data instead of the other way around. Ethnography is another that is extremely time consuming. It can get really expensive as well, but very helpful when we're looking at a research problem within a broader sort of sociocultural context. So, holistic inquiry, looking at how people work together, networks of people, social institutions, groups of people. Similarly to grounded theory, it uses data collection methods like interviews and field work and participant observation, which is, kind of unique to ethnography in that you're not just observing your research participants, you're working with them, you're doing what they're doing while you're in the field with them. And so the sort of final product of this is this ethnography, the in-depth account of whatever that research problem is, from the perspective of the participants. It's kind of an insider-outsider look at that problem in the broader cultural context. So again, like I said, higher level overview of possible qualitative designs, recognizing, of course, that it's not the full, there are many more. You'll also include a section on your role as the researcher. So are you an observer? Are you a participant? Are you both? What is your role in the research? Okay, we have to be very clear here. I am, sort of on a personal and academic level, a big believer in subjective reality. Okay, and I know that that's not the same for everyone, and I know that that's not the same for all social scientists or people conducting qualitative research, but we need to talk about our role and how we as humans impact our studies with other humans, right? So what biases do we bring to the table? Okay, identifying these up front, talking about them and how we plan to mitigate these. Talking about any power differentials between ourselves and our participants, depending on who we're working with and where we're working. Do we have some, is there a conflict of interest, or do we have some power over our participants? We want to describe any of this as clearly and as in great detail as possible. Okay, it's really important because the sort of objective nature of qualitative research is not necessarily there, and so we just want to be very transparent about who we are and what we bring to the table and how we can minimize our own personal beliefs and set those aside when we're conducting research. You'll have a section on the methodology then. So I like to think of this as sort of a big section on methodology, and then there are different subsections in here. So like the participants. So in the section on the methodology, you'll describe your participants, the population, so the overall group of people from which you will draw the sample, what your sampling strategy is. So this is not going to be random sampling like you might see in a quantitative study. You are generally looking for people who meet specific criteria. Okay, that's very different from random sampling. So it is not random, it is purposeful or purposive. And this is where you want to outline what those inclusion criteria are. So what are the characteristics that people must meet, people must possess to be eligible to participate in your study? And then you want to describe how you will verify that information. Okay, you want to talk about the number of participants that you plan to recruit. This is going to be, there's not a good hard and fast rule for this. I get a lot of questions about, what should my sample size be? The answer is really, you want to turn to the literature. You want to turn to other scholars who have conducted similar research to your own and look at their samples. How many people did they recruit? Okay, and this will give you a good idea of what what you should be looking at. This is also where you will outline the steps to identify, contact, and recruit your participants. And sometimes I think it's really helpful in this section if you outline all of this in sort of, number it out, bullet it out. Step 1, step 2, step 3. And then from there, you can go back and put it into narrative form in the chapter. But it is, it's a linear process. That's what your committee is going to want to see. So if you think about it in steps, I think it helps to, make sure that you have all of the information there that you need to be there. And then you'll also want to talk about the sample size and its relationship to data saturation, or the point at which you're not receiving new information, novel information. So if you collect, in your last 3 interviews, if you're not learning anything new, your data are probably saturated. So, and that's just an example, but you'll talk about that and the relationship to the sample size. You'll include a section on instrumentation as well. So it may be that you're conducting a phenomenological study and you have an interview protocol and that's it for your instruments, but maybe you're conducting a case study where you're also, conducting observations as well. So if that's the case, you'll have a data collection instrument for each source of data. So interviews, observations. You'll describe all of that here. So what is the source for each instrument? Usually in qualitative studies, we create our own research instruments or data collection instruments. So you'll talk about, is this something that you're creating on your own, or is it something that's already published? If you're creating it on your own, you'll want to describe in here a little bit more about the decisions that you made. Why are you asking these research or these interview questions? Where did those come from? If you're conducting a document review, you'll want to identify the source of the documents, and you also want to talk in this section about how you'll verify accuracy as well. So the real key here is to make the case that these data sources are sufficient to collect data you need to address your research questions. In your procedures for recruitment, participation, and data collection, this is where you provide even greater detail on all of these steps for recruiting, okay, for what your participants will be doing, how you will collect data. So if you think of this in terms of each research instrument, okay, going back to that last slide, for each instrument, you'll want to provide information on where you'll collect the data, who will collect the data. Most often that's you as the researcher, but maybe you are one of those lucky ducks who has a team of research assistants, and maybe they're collecting data for you. And if so, oh, you're so lucky. You'll talk about the frequency of data collection events and the duration. So how many weeks or months are you going to, conduct interviews that are an hour, 3 hours? How do you plan to record the data? And importantly, any contingency plans in case of loss to attrition. So if people drop out of this study, all of a sudden you need to do some follow-up and you can't get a hold of them, how you plan to handle that, how you'll recruit enough people. You'll also include in this section any debriefing procedures, following interviews, for example, and any follow-up procedures if you want to have your participants verify their transcripts or conduct any member checking after you have analyzed data. The other sort of subsection that you'll include in the methodology is the data analysis plan. So here you'll have an idea of how you plan to analyze your data, but certainly you haven't completed the data analysis yet. So this is just what you plan to do. And so for some designs, this is prescribed for you. Some designs like interpretative phenomenological analyses are pretty clear about the steps to analyze qualitative data, but that's not the case for all designs. So you want to talk about how the data are connected to the research. So again, how your data are going to address the research questions, and then what your plans and procedures are for coding the data. Ultimately, all qualitative data analysis is boiling down a lot of text into codes. So breaking it apart and then putting those codes back together based on patterns, or you might call them themes. So whatever those coding procedures are, any software that you plan to use in the analysis. And I also get a lot of questions about what the best software is to use. And so if you're thinking that, my response is whatever is free through your university, or whatever you can get your hands on for a good price. They all fundamentally work the same way. It's all researcher driven. There is no software that's going to magically code and thematize your data for you, unfortunately. So given that, if your school offers free use of one program, use that. You'll also talk about how you plan to handle any discrepant cases that might come up. So anything that doesn't fit the patterns that you see emerging. In qualitative research, we don't toss those out, unfortunately. So, it might be that one participant is just like very different from all of the other participants, but we can't just disregard that because it tells us something interesting, right? So how you plan to handle that in the data analysis. You'll include a section on trustworthiness as well. So the 4 tenets that we often talk about in qualitative research are credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. There's quite a bit written on these. So how confident are we that our findings are accurate, that they can be applied to other contexts, that they are consistent with replicability, and then that they're based on what our participants say and not our own ideas about things. So those are the 4 tenets. They can be established in different ways. I realize this slide is kind of set up to make it look mutually exclusive. So for example, like triangulation can only be used to establish credibility. That's not necessarily the case. So this is where you talk about how you plan to establish trustworthiness in your study, what techniques those are that you'll use. And then your ethical procedures. So this is a big part of working with human subjects, right? So any agreements that you need to gain access to your participants, your research site, your data, you'll likely have your school's institutional review board or IRB, but it could be the case that your research site also has their own IRB or other permissions and procedures that you would need to obtain prior to collecting data. So this is where you describe that. Any of those permissions, this is where you think through in advance all possible ethical considerations related to working with humans. So how do you plan to recruit participants ethically, and how do you plan to collect data ethically? How do you plan to maintain participant confidentiality throughout the whole process, right? Your participants are probably known to you, so they're not anonymous. So you have to maintain their confidentiality. So this is really thinking through like all of these possibilities, okay, and how we're going to keep human subjects safe. And then the plans to secure data and what you will do with the data after a period of time. So most schools say you have to destroy the data after a certain number of years. Let's say it's 5 years, and you'll want to check with your university on that. But what are your plans to destroy the data after that time? And I will say, this is one, you want to be, this chapter has a lot of detail in it. You want to be as detailed as possible because this ultimately lends itself to the replicability and somebody being able to come along and follow the same steps that you have taken to replicate your study or reproduce it maybe in a different context or something like that. But this ethical procedures, the more you can pump into this section, the more you can think through all of this, the easier your IRB process will be when you get to your IRB application. In your summary, don't phone it in here. I see this happen a lot. It's still part of the chapter. So this is where you want to really drive home the key points. This is your elevator speech. This is your last pitch. This is where if someone only had time to read the summary, what do they need to know to understand your study moving into the results chapter? So you do want to recap the main points, okay? But it's not just in this chapter, I did this and this and this and this and this. Right? That's phoning it in. Don't do that. You want to provide a bit more depth than that. And then again, as always, looking forward, then you want to transition into the next chapter, which is usually going to be your results chapter. So I have some other tips about how to approach this chapter. Chapter 3 is tricky, or the methods chapter is tricky. It requires you to think and write in a way that's a little bit different from what you may have done in your first 2 chapters of your dissertation, okay? You are planning for something that you have not done yet, and that can feel immediately overwhelming. I see a lot of students spin their wheels here, going, what if this happens? And what if that happens? And you know what? Plan for it. Something's going to happen. Something's going to interrupt your research. It could be like a 2+ year worldwide pandemic that has disrupted all of our lives. It might not be something that big, but you know, plan for something to come up. We're working with people and we are people, and it's just kind of the nature of research. Things don't always go according to plan, but don't let that stop you from writing this chapter. So break this down, right? Think about your problem, think about your purpose, think about your research questions. That drives absolutely everything that comes after. You do not work backward from your design. So problem, purpose, research questions. Think about what are the data that you need to be able to answer your research questions, address the purpose, answer the problem, okay, solve the problem. Who do you need to talk to find those answers? Or what documents might give you those answers? What observations might give you those answers? Okay, so flesh it out in that way. Think about writing this as a recipe, right? So recipe has 2 parts. If I'm making chocolate chip cookies, I need to know both the ingredients and the instructions, right? The ingredients without the instructions don't make any sense. I don't know how to combine the chocolate chips with the butter and the sugar and the flour, okay? On the flip side, if I'm only given the instructions, I don't know how much I need to put in, right? I don't know how many cups of flour or cups of sugar or cups of chocolate chips, right? You have to have both. The methods are your ingredients. The methodology is the instructions. So here's what you do. Here's how you put it all together. This is what you need. This is how you put it together, okay? These will change. Be comfortable with that. It is okay. This chapter, even when it's approved, things are going to change, okay? So you handle that later on, right? This is the expectation of what you plan to do. If things change, you'll talk about that in your results chapter. You'll talk about it in your discussion chapter. You know, maybe things changed, presented some limitations for you. That's perfectly okay. But don't let the worry of things changing stop you from getting started with this chapter, okay? You can address all of the rest of it later. If you need additional support, that's exactly why we're here. So again, we are Statistic Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting company. We are here to provide support throughout the entire dissertation process, topic development, all the way through to final dissertation defense. And again, we have a team of research mentors, qualitative and quantitative specialists on staff to help you wherever you are in the process. So you can email us, you can give us a call, check out our website, get scheduled for a 30-minute complimentary consultation so that we can talk more about your own specific needs and where we might fit into that plan so that we can get you done with your dissertation and on with the rest of your life. Again, our website has a ton of really great free resources as well. Brittany has linked some of those in the chat. So definitely take advantage of those. You will be receiving a copy of the webinar and the slide deck within the next day or two. So if you came in late, you know, that's no problem, but definitely I would say get your complimentary consultation scheduled so that we can talk more about how we can help out. We know that dissertations take a long time and it is helpful to have someone kind of, you know, to guide and be on your side. So if there are questions about qualitative methods, go ahead and pop those into the question and answer box, and I can address those now just in the order that they come in. It looks like I do have a question about if you have two sub-questions beyond the research question, what do we call these if not hypotheses? Your answer is actually in the question, sub-questions. I have a question about in case we're going to employ both quantitative and qualitative, so a mixed methods approach, how to prioritize both approaches while also getting our hypothesis stated at the same time. Yeah, you'd need to look into the material on mixed methods because there are different types of mixed methods designs. So depending on what your problem, purpose, and research questions are, there are different ways to set up qualitative and quantitative phases in there. So you would have hypotheses associated with any quantitative design, any quantitative tests in there, but I would definitely encourage you to look to the mixed methods literature for the different sort of options that are available. Are there other questions that I can answer this afternoon? I'm not seeing anything. All right, so certainly check out our website for upcoming webinars. Get yourself scheduled for those. We have webinars on, I have a qualitative results chapter webinar next week, but we also have quantitative webinars. We have webinars on, you know, the lit review chapter, the discussion chapter. So there's a lot of really good stuff coming up. Thank you all so much for joining me today, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, where you are. I wish you the best on your journey. Good luck, take care, you can do this. Bye.